Okay. Hi again. So we're shifting to AI policies. With us here we have Sebastien A Krier, an AI policy and ethics advisor and former head of regulation at the UK Office for Artificial Intelligence. Sebastien is an experienced policy advisor in AI and tech policy with a proven record of advising senior stakeholder in ministries, designing evidence-based strategies, building relationships, and managing projects from concept to completion. He is now advising organizations and governments on AI ethics, policy, strategy, and regulation. So we will have like 4 rounds of questions covering 4 different subtopics. The first one will cover AI policies with a focus on UK and EU experience. The second one will be about government use of AI. The third will focus more specifically on EU and its regulations. And the fourth one on the future of AI policies and AI regulations. So this one is going to be conversational. So hi, Sebastien. So I'm starting. So you've worked at the Office for AI, which is the British government, as a head of regulation. And many people who are listening to this are either engineers or business people. So it would be really nice to introduce AI policy to them. So what was your job and what is the Office for AI?
Hey, thanks for having me here. So I think I see AI policy as a relatively new field where people think about how AI technologies and systems should be overseen, regulated, incentivized, and understood. So really, it's how do you ensure the responsible development of AI through various tools and mechanisms like policy, law, standards, and other governance frameworks. So in fact, I think I even prefer the term kind of AI governance because not everything has to be done through kind of policy making or legislation. And I joined the Office for AI back in 2018. So that's a joint unit between 2 ministries in the UK, and the Office for AI is responsible for delivering some of the promises the UK government's made on AI in the last few years. And so a lot of work was done on data, on international collaboration, on the adoption of AI, on leadership, and particularly on skills and talent. So there's been lots of very interesting projects, and if you Google the Office for AI, I'm sure you'll find that page, and a lot of them are there. But as for me personally, so I initially focused on the public sector use of AI. So I worked with a lot of different kind of departments in government, did a review of how the UK government was using AI, developing AI, worked closely with Faculty AI, a great company, and the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National AI and Data Institute, on developing guidance for civil servants on safe and ethical AI. So that was some of the initial work, and then I switched a bit to regulation, doing a lot more work on looking at how to strengthen regulators, how to think about regulation of AI, and analyzing a bit of the EU's plans on that front. A lot of other projects as well. It's been a very kind of exciting 2 years, a bit less than that. We've also looked at things like international collaboration with other countries that we're close to, such as Canada, France, Estonia, and so on and so forth. So that's broadly AI policy and my role when I was at the Office for AI in a nutshell.
Thanks. So the question is like how AI technologies are being regulated in the UK and EU. Like how does one approach regulating stuff like AI anyway?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. Both the UK and the EU have very different approaches to regulation in AI, and I'd say that in my view, the UK is doing a little bit too little, and the EU is doing arguably a bit too much. So in the UK, the original approach was there's no need for an AI regulator or anything of the sort. It doesn't really make sense. It's like having a data science regulator, a statistics regulator, but instead, existing regulators should be kind of upskilled and giving more funding to be able to analyze and understand how AI might impact their respective sectors. So it's a very kind of vertical approach, and as a result of that, you've had existing regulators doing some really good work, like the FCA is doing a lot of work on AI in the financial sector, or the ICO, which is the kind of national data regulator, looking at things like the auditing of AI systems. So there's been some interesting progress on these fronts, but overall, things have been a little bit slow, and there hasn't been kind of as much thinking, I think, as there has been in the EU. In fact, one area I'm particularly, in general, kind of interested in is, the public sector governance and regulation of AI. And there's a report by the Committee on Standards in Public Life that found that governance frameworks for AI in the public sector remain a work in progress, and deficiencies were notable. So I think there's still a lot to do, a bit more to do, but understandably the UK is also quite busy with a bunch of other things at the moment. And as for the EU, they've taken a far more proactive approach, and one that's been very informed, it seems, by the precautionary principle. So when von der Leyen came to the power last year, I think she wanted to regulate AI within the first 100 days of her mandate. So you get an idea. And the EU had the high-level expert group on kind of AI, and they've since had various white papers on data, AI, and safety and liability. And the approach was a lot more preemptory. So it was looking at, what should we do now? What kind of frameworks we need to have in place now to ensure that AI gets developed responsibly in the future? And, lots of different proposals, but broadly, there's been some around essentially separating low risk from high risk AI systems. And for the high risk systems, adding various kind of requirements and obligations. And there's debates as to, what shape does that take? Is it like ex ante, as in before kind of deployment, or is it ex post? Is it through things like conformity assessments, voluntary labeling? And all of this is kind of being discussed right now, particularly after the EU. I mean, they're still kind of reviewing a lot of the consultation responses they received on this. And so, overall, I think they're doing a great job thinking about these issues. And it's, it's nice to see proactivity in the field and trying to really understand, potential deficiencies in the product liability directive, for example. But I also think a lot of the recommendations are a little bit premature. Some of the proposals I'm a bit skeptical about in terms of costs, and some aspects of of EU's digital sovereignty kind of agenda feel a little bit protectionist to me. But in short, this is kind of how the EU and the UK look at this, and it's tricky to generally kind of understand how to approach AI regulation. I think because AI really can have so many different types of applications and so many different types of sectors. Like a chatbot for entertainment will be completely different than a chatbot advising on mental health issues. So I do think there's a need for a more vertical and kind of context aware approach, but how do you do that right is a question we're still trying to work out.
Right, and how do policymakers engage with different stakeholders and professionals in creating sustainable AI regulation? As it's a collaborative effort, right? So I don't know how to involve academia, businesses.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of different kind of mechanisms for that. I mean, the one that's most commonly used is kind of advisory or expert boards. At the EU, you have the kind of high-level expert group. In the UK, you've got the AI Council, which is kind of a council that was created by the Office for AI and has a lot of experts from academia, civil society, and industry sitting there and giving kind of independent guidance to governments. And so that's one way to do it. The other way is through public consultations. So as I mentioned before, the EU has been quite open about their plans on AI and looking for feedback from a whole cross-section of society, like NGOs, professors, academics, companies, and so on and so forth. And you've had this in the UK as well. When the ICO had their AI auditing framework, they requested a lot of comments from the public. And in fact, I think there's even one that's open right now, an open consultation on intellectual property law and AI. And I think that's with the IPO, the Intellectual Property Office, and it's closing on the 30th of November, if anyone's interested in commenting on that. And the last one, I think, is well, industry groups are pretty important in that respect. So groups like Tech UK or Digital Europe have a lot of involvement with policymakers and with academics and so on. And this is another forum where a lot of these discussions happen and where kind of different sides collaborate. But overall, I think it's obviously encouraging, but I also think inadequate in many respects. I'm personally a little bit concerned sometimes, where I think there's insufficient expertise within government. And you sometimes see that when you listen to kind of members of Congress or Parliament talking about AI, and the how often buzzwords get used. I think there's something that'd be useful or nice to have is something like the Tech Congress scheme you have in the US, to essentially kind of incentivize placing experts in Parliament or in the civil service and vice versa. I think that kind of stuff would be very helpful and useful.
Thank you. We're shifting now to government and its use of AI. So I mean, governments around the world are using tons of automation in so many places. So in some cases, those are like some like really advanced AI solutions. So like if you could name some of those things, like some AI public sector applications, so uses of AI for public
Yeah,
good.
I think there's I mean, firstly, I think there's also, it depends what you mean by advanced. There's a lot of, great applications, but also a lot that are quite kind of immature or feeble. And I'm thinking, for example, about, various policing algorithms used around the world. I've seen cases in some countries where emotion recognition is used for policing, which is kind of absurd, I think, given, how these systems malfunction. And but obviously, there's also a lot of very good examples. When I was preparing the guide to using AI in government back then, we spoke to a lot of different parts of government to understand how they used AI, and we've had some really great examples on how, for example, the Department for International Development used satellite imagery in their work and machine learning to help kind of plan vaccination campaigns and population census. Um, One of my favorite examples is from the Stanford Immigration Policy Lab. They work very closely with the Swiss and the US governments, and they used machine learning to develop algorithms to geographically place refugees to optimize their overall employment rates. And that had really kind of positive consequences. I think the algorithm improved the employment prospects of refugees by 40% in the US and something like 75% in Switzerland. So these are the type of applications I'm very excited about. Equally, you have some smaller ones like the Swedish Forest Agency working with Microsoft and using AI to identify trees damaged by moths, for example, and that helps protect forests and limit damage across the trees. And there's a lot of these also being used by HMRC to detect tax fraud, for example. So a lot of very encouraging use cases, but equally, I think some use cases across the world that are quite concerning as well.
Right. And what about like possible dangers in the government use of AI? So what would be like the biggest ones? Like what can go wrong, let's say?
So I think that there's a lot of kind of inadequacies or potential problems with AI, inherent to AI, let's say, and I think when used by governments, well, that's potentially even more concerning given powers governments have and so on. But the one of them is quality and safety more generally. So I think when you have irresponsible data management, negligent design or production processes, and so on, questionable deployment practices, all that can lead to AI systems that produce unsafe or poor quality outcomes, and that's something I'm concerned about. And you've seen an example of that earlier this year with the A-level scandal in the UK. It might have not been kind of AI per se, but it was automated decision making, and I think even in cases where this is really public and everything, it's already quite concerning. So I'm equally concerned about cases where things aren't really out there in the public to for journalists to scrutinize. There's also bias, which is the one we hear about a lot, rightly so. Because machine learning models gain their insights from existing structures and dynamics of the societies they analyze, well, they can reproduce and reinforce and amplify these patterns, and therefore kind of increase or at least cement marginalization, inequality, discrimination that's already existent. And I can see that being quite a concern, in a society that increasingly uses algorithms in lots of different ways. Tracking them and their impacts over the long term might be tricky, and quite concerned about these negative feedback loops. Thirdly, there's accountability. Sometimes it's very difficult for citizens to know who to hold accountable, which if a decision was made through an automated decision making system, how do you essentially revise that? How do you what can you say against it? What are your rights of redress? And these kind of mechanisms to enhance accountability, I think, are in some ways inadequate still. And then you've got transparency. So as we know, a lot of machine learning models are quite opaque, or at least difficult to reverse engineer to really understand why decisions were made. And I think that might be okay if you've got a very good skin cancer detection tool, but you can't explain how it detected the cancer. But it'll be a lot more problematic in a judicial or criminal context, for example. So again, you need a lot of transparency and a lot of oversight around these things. But these are qualities I think that are inherent to most AI systems, regardless of who deploys them. But I'm also personally concerned about digital authoritarianism in some countries around the world. So it's really about how AI might be used. Is it to control or arrest people? Is it to restrict speech? Is it to further repress rights? And that's the kind of stuff I'm slightly more concerned about. Is you're using kind of occasionally kind of feeble systems, and if you're using them for doing stuff that one would deem wrong, then there's a lot of scope for harm, I think.
Speaking of public, like are there like effective ways to like have some sort of public oversight of what government is using
Um,
with AI technologies?
Yeah, well, I think there's the obvious one is the judicial systems going through the courts when possible, and that's in the UK at least it's through judicial reviews, for example. And here not so long ago, the Court of Appeal had found that the South Wales Police's use of facial recognition was unlawful, and I think the decision also found that there were fundamental deficiencies in the legal framework around the use of facial recognition. And so the judicial system is definitely one to use and will set kind of precedents for the long term. And I think it's one worth keeping an eye on. And you've got like new specialized boutique law firms now, like Foxglove and so on, really dedicating a lot of resources and efforts on these. And then you've got general advocacy by civil society and investigative journalism. There's some really great work by journalists out there, and I think that needs to be actively supported because it takes a lot of time to really kind of unearth, scrutinize, and understand these systems. So, for example, there's a project by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism called Decision Machines, and investigates how government is gathering and using data from citizens and feeding that into automated decision-making systems. And they've done a lot of great work. Even when I was in government, I sometimes learned more through them than I had through kind of my own work. So I think that's something to support. And generally, there's been some initiatives by cities recently that I thought were quite laudable. So Helsinki and Amsterdam, announced the launch of open AI registers, and these registers describe what, where, and how AI applications are being used, and what data sets are used, looking at bias and potential risks, and they even offer like an open feedback channel. And I think that kind of stuff is super, super important. I think transparency is key because A, it fosters public trust, but also as a government agency or department, you don't necessarily you might not have thought about every possible way things might have gone wrong, or you might have missed stuff. And ensuring that external third parties, civil society is able to scrutinize and look at your AI systems and algorithms, I think that's a pretty good thing in general. So I think this is quite exciting, and I'd say more of that would be really good. But overall, I find that the onus shouldn't always necessarily be on the public to constantly control government and to keep an eye on everything. I think you should have the right structures and institutional mechanisms in place to hold government to account. And so I mentioned earlier in the UK we have the Centre for Data Innovation and Ethics, and they do some really excellent work on in reports on different kind of risks and regulation and privacy and so on and so forth. But in my ideal world, their role would also be to kind of scrutinize what government does. And I think this kind of balance of powers would be beneficial in both incentivizing trust, but also leading to better kind of AI development and deployment.
Shifting to EU now, it's very interesting to compare to different let's say cultural paradigms. The US, EU, China, totally different stuff. So what would be differences between those three in regards to AI from your practical experience? How would you describe those differences? Let's say from the regulation standpoint, some things are allowed and cherished in some countries. But yeah,
I think there's definitely obviously difference in their approaches, and the US, I think their approach so far, at least from what we've seen from the White House, is to base AI ethics rules on existing legislation and regulation. So I think the philosophy really is around only consider new regulation when when there's a real need and you think that federal regulation is necessary. So it's been I wouldn't say it's a laissez-faire approach, because I do think there's also a lot of work going on in different states at the federal and kind of state level and so on various different parts of AI policy, whether on cloud, whether on privacy, whether on kind of various facial recognition. So I think there's definitely stuff happening. They're also less loud about it, but overall I think it's a more kind of permissive regulatory regime in that sense. the EU, as we've seen, and they've been very kind of proactive and been looking at all these different kind of ways of preempting harms. So it's not so much about waiting for the harms to happen and then say, oh, maybe we should do something here. It's really to try to think about them in advance and try to address these. And the EU is, I guess, trying to position itself as a responsible player, between the US and China. I don't think that's necessarily the the right approach, and I think it's perhaps a bit dismissive of how others do it. But I guess the EU is trying to really make sure that the AI developed in the EU is really in line with kind of EU values and consistent with these. And China, as far as I know, isn't really looking at regulating AI very much. There's some recent legislation on data privacy, which I think is being enforced well, and some kind of private sector government funding, initiatives on operationalizing AI ethics. And there's increasingly a lot of noise on the civil society side and academia in terms of AI ethics. It's actually probably wrong to say that China doesn't care about ethics at all and that kind of stuff. But there's a different approach to it. It's a bit more of a kind of collectivist approach that you need to see in the US on the one hand, and secondly, I guess the part of the focus of the government is also regulating the behavior of citizens. And so that's part of, I guess, my concern in some ways about how China does that is the use of AI to control. And that is obviously kind of not necessarily subject to oversight and scrutiny and so on and so forth. So, three broad kind of approaches, all of them with pros and cons, but I think it's a field that's very difficult to regulate to start with. And so it's all, going quite slowly, and we'll see as time progresses kind of what's the best approach. But so far, I think this is the state of play. Yeah.
AI safety, like there was quite a buzz around that, and like how big it is actually, like the problem of AI safety, and like if we have like those type of potential problems, like what's the role of government in it, and what are the roles of private companies who build those like systems?
So I guess AI safety, I'd say that's basically the endeavor to ensure that AI is deployed in ways that don't harm humanity. That's basically aligned with human values and preferences. And also AI that can be kind of controlled and understood. And for that to happen, I think you obviously need technical solutions, research, and so on, but equally some governance mechanisms. You need the right incentives and the right frameworks for that to kind of actually, happen and blossom. And I think we're all aware of the many ways AI can cause harm and has caused harm and accidents, whether it's with self-driving cars or chatbots and so on. And so far, they've been, I think they've been, pretty bad in many respects. But I think as these systems keep, getting better and developing and increasing and scaling, I think these accidents will also equally, the frequency and the seriousness of these accidents will also going to grow in parallel. And so I think, particularly as AI becomes more and more capable. So in my view, it's pretty important. AI safety is like really an area that needs a lot of investment, both from governments in terms of, for example, supporting research, and from the private sector, particularly because the private sector houses all this kind of machine learning talent, and I think it's therefore pretty important for that to happen. And it almost to me it makes like almost commercial sense, because it's like a firm building bridges but not really caring about the how durable the bridge is or how safe it is. I think both things go hand in hand, they're complementary. But sometimes what you see in the private sector is that companies tend to think about the AI safety a little bit less and concentrate more on getting their product or service out to the market as fast as possible. And so I think that's obviously not something you want. You don't want kind of a race towards the bottom. So generally, yeah, I think value alignment and whether for short-term, medium-term, or long-term type kind of risk, I think AI safety is a pretty important field, and one where more investment is needed, just generally, kind of both in terms of talent and funding.
What about like big companies who are like at the forefront of the AI research? They have a lot of money, they have talents because they have data, so like engineers just go there. So like they have like a very, let's say, influential, defining role in basically telling where the AI is going. So like, what's in your opinion their role in like developing policies, like responsible AI policies, and their collaboration with governments and international institutions in the future?
I think they, I mean, even now already, I think there's quite a big role for them to get engaged with policy and policymakers. And to be fair, they hire some excellent people, and their contribution can often be quite invaluable. So, for example, a lot of research from Facebook, their FAIR team, have been quite useful. A lot of open source tools being created by various large companies might be very useful in terms of standard setting and so on. So there's definitely a space for them, and I think it's it's important not to kind of demonize them unreasonably and just say, oh, as soon as there's a Google person in here or something, this is really bad and evil. So I think there's a lot of kind of talent in there, and in by way of parallel, if you look in the financial sector, a lot of big investment banks, hedge funds, and so on work quite closely with the FCA. And I think that's the kind of, you need that. You can't just, do away with that. But on the other hand, I think it's important to remember that these large companies also have incentives of their own. And these incentives don't necessarily always align. And there's definitely risks of regulatory capture, for example. Or, these large companies have armies of lawyers and huge legal departments. So they might propose things or regulations or something that, they can potentially afford, but that might produce barriers of entry for smaller companies and SMEs. And therefore kind of entrenching their leading positions. So that needs to be, something that policymakers bear in mind, regulators as well. And as such, you can't just rely on how these big companies kind of, well, the advice of these large companies uniquely. You need to also speak to lots of SMEs, lots of startups, civil society organizations, NGOs, academia, and so on. I mean, it's truly a space where there's like a huge diversity of talent and profiles, and I think it's really important to kind of leverage all of that and not just focus on the shiny stuff. But broadly, yeah, I think there's a big role for these large tech companies. It just has to be done in a way that's kind of both transparent and also kind of smart in the way governments approach that.
Yeah, based on that, if those big companies have the knowledge, the latest knowledge, the people, the talent, and basically everything, and on the other side, there's government with old politicians who don't know stuff. So what are the tools and some partnerships government can have to counter
So I mentioned earlier, for example, the Tech Congress scheme in the US, and I think that's the kind of stuff you really need. You need to ensure there's more kind of cross-pollination, if you want, or people from kind of industry maybe going to government, people from government going to industry maybe as well. But that has to be done in a particular way. But yeah, you're right. I think most of the machine learning talent and the expertise and so on really kind of lies with the private sector. And the rate of how fast AI is developing is not matched by the rate of how fast government is responding to all of that. And to me, that's a bit concerning. And so, I think there needs to be some big thing in government. How do you just generally, in fact, reform perhaps the civil service, your hiring practices, who works in government and how and why and so on. So there needs to be some changes on that front, and equally changes to basically ensure that people from someone who's hesitating between, do I just go and work for Microsoft or Facebook, or do I go for the government, that they have a good reason to also want to do the latter. So yeah, there's a need here.
So I mean, there were some parallels in some academic research between AI and nuclear powers and weapons. So basically something that of the outstanding, potentially very dangerous power. So it's a future perspective view. So and nuclear power is highly internationally regulated. So speaking of regulations related to AIs and AI in general, do you see something similar happening, as in more unified global governance approach? And if you could name some initiatives in that regard, and
Sure.
what do you think?
I think that's a really interesting question. There's actually a really great podcast I highly recommend to everyone called 80,000 Hours. And in one of the episodes with Alan Defoe, who's one of the directors for the Center for the Governance of AI at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford, where he explains that basically AI is even more concerning than nuclear power in two respects. Firstly, nuclear energy, it was useful, but it wasn't crucially useful. Whereas AI, on the other hand, is on track to become the new electricity. The potential for AI is far greater than the potential was for nuclear. So that's on the one hand. And secondly, separating the dangerous capabilities from civilian ones in nuclear is arguably a lot easier to do than it would be with AI, which makes things quite complicated. And actually, I'm not too sure what that could look in practice, really. I've and it's funny you mentioned nuclear. I think of it a few months ago when I was particularly bored. I tried to redraft the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, but we're trying to refocusing and shaping it a bit to focus on data and AI. And at a high level, it seems good, but then a lot of difficulties arise when you think about the details. Who checks what exactly? What are the minimum thresholds of transparency? It's very difficult to think about this in practical detail. But I do think that an international governance network, a framework, is extremely important. I think you need minimum thresholds of standards that are acceptable across borders and cultures to an extent. And doing that is difficult, but it's necessary, and that needs mutual understanding, transparency, and discussions. I think you need multilateralism here, and I think we're pretty far from that at the moment. Although with the kind of Biden win, I'm more optimistic on that front, at least slightly. And there are initiatives out there at the moment that kind of try to do that to an extent. Things that UNESCO is drafting a recommendation on AI ethics, and that's really laudable. But I'm also equally not sure how, I guess, credible it is for UNESCO to do that, and whether that really also touches on AI safety issues and so on. And it's after all, it's also just a recommendation to governments, so it's not the same. It doesn't have the same legal power as an international treaty. And there's also recently been the creation of the Global Partnership on AI, and they've been thinking about similar stuff as well. They've got some really great working groups and experts advising them, and it'd be interesting to see where that goes. But GPI doesn't really include China or other important countries in the field, so it remains to be seen how and whether they engage. Anyway, that's not necessarily a problem, depending on what they're trying to do. But overall, I think there's a real need now for some actual kind of multilateral cooperation, collaboration, because I think the risks here are big, particularly when you think about warfare and potentially lethal autonomous weapons, and you want to avoid accidents in that space in general. So we'll see what happens, but yeah, I think it's not a bad analogy, I guess, with nuclear.
We have two more questions that arrived from the audience. So the one is on AI safety and AI alignment. So are you also interested in those issues? And this is you can see the.
Yeah. So I'm potentially interested in AI safety and AI alignment in general. So if by you, I mean me personally, yes, definitely. I tend to follow the literature on that. There's some good newsletters out there. A lot of interesting stuff from Les Strong and everything. And I think one of my favorite papers this year was from Yace and Gabriel at DeepMind, who wrote a really nice paper on value alignment and different approaches to that. So yeah, I'm personally very interested, and I think that AI safety and ethics are both in some ways quite interconnected and at least overlap. And I'm personally at least thinking a lot about what needs to be done at various levels, the policy level, what needs to be done within an organization, what needs to be done on the academic level. And so I think there's this really good paper published a couple of months ago, a bit more longer than that earlier, but called Towards a Trustworthy Development of AI or something like that, Towards Trustworthy AI, yeah. And I think it was from Miles Brundage and a lot of other really great authors. And I think some of their recommendations in there, both on software, hardware, and kind of organizational design, I think were quite important in ensuring that AI safety is taken seriously. So yeah, I'm personally interested, and I think governments ought to be, but I'm not sure I've seen that much kind of like I said, effort investment on that front. And I think that's an area that's really ripe for that, because it's the kind of stuff where you might not necessarily have natural incentives in the private sector to spend lots of money and time on this stuff. So that's definitely something I think governments should also be more interested in.
Just throw one more question on startups. Startups who are trying to solve public problems and try to sell their AI software to the government. So if you could share any of those experiences and procedures and whatever from the UK.
Yeah. So when I was working in government, for example, I mentioned earlier working with Faculty AI. So not sure if they can still be described as a startup, but they're definitely a new player in the field, and they and it was it's really good working with them. And I think there needs to be more of that in general. I think there's a lot of talent that's not just in the big kind of GAFAMs and can be found everywhere. And for that, the onus is on government to make it easier for startups and SMEs to work with government. Because to be fair, it's a pain to work with government. The procurement processes are slow. You don't know when you're going to get paid. It takes a while. Negotiations take a while. You never know who to speak to. There's 1,000 different people. People change all the time. It's, if I was a startup, I wouldn't be particularly incentivized or keen to work with government. That wouldn't be my first port of call. And so I think it's important for government to understand that and to try to facilitate engagement on that front. And I think in the UK, what's been happening, so at the Office for AI, we've published some guidance on procuring AI, which is it's good, but it's guidance. It doesn't really change structures. And I think there's been some trials and testing of a new framework called Spark, at least at the time that was what it was called. I don't know if it's still going on and what's happening on that front. I haven't really followed, but people are aware of that being a problem, and there's kind of attempts at creating a more agile kind of framework for companies to be able to sell their products and collaborate with government. There's a great kind of company called Public. They're some sort of VC startup builder organization, and they and they do a lot of very interesting reports and work on kind of procurement and startups working with government and how to kind of facilitate that. So I really recommend having a read at that. But yeah, I think that's another area where you need more efforts to ensure the government isn't just ossified and out of date, and can also function as most modern institutions and organizations do.
Right. I don't think we have any more questions.
Cool.
So yeah, I mean, I would like to use the opportunity to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank for participating and sharing some insights and experiences.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
It's been great.